Mind Brain Talks, the place where you find diverse and scientifically accurate information regarding psychology, neuropsychology, neurosciences, and research methods every single week. My name is Nº4. I am a licensed clinical psychologist and neuropsychologist who's been working as a therapist, researcher, and educator for the past few years. Here in Mind Brain Talks, I discuss and describe different topics from psychology to neurosciences, and I try to explain them the best as I can for you to understand and for you to learn something more about it. All research here are just for educational purposes, and it's not intended to diagnose any psychiatric condition or neurological disorder. So, without further delay, let's jump for today's content. So today I'll talk about emotional experience. I'll take a brief look of the major topics of emotions, and we will see how emotional experience may impact in different areas of human functioning. But first, let's see the manuals that I recommend to you today. The first is The Emotional Brain from Joseph Lido. The second is True to Our Feelings. And the third is the Handbook of Emotion Regulation, edited by James Gross. And now let's look to emotions. Emotions are the short-term biological states associated with neurophysiological changes which provoke us thoughts, feelings and behavioral responses or action tendencies. Emotions tend to be discrete, measurable and physiologically distinct from one another. Emotion experience is different from emotions. So, emotional experiences is the subjective experience of emotions or emotional states. Emotions are the short-term biological states, and emotional experience is the subjective experience that individuals have when they are experiencing emotions. And emotional experiences may be described as pleasant or unpleasant, and may be described as intense or mild. Emotional states are accompanied by arousal and our experiences of the bodily responses created by the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. So, emotional states are accompanied by different bodily sensations which represent a sympathetic activation of the autonomic nervous system. Emotions are developed in large part to help us to make rapid judgments about stimuli and to quickly guide appropriate behavior. That's why emotions set some behavioral tendencies. Emotions have a great neurobiological emphasis because they are produced in the limbic system, which encompasses amygdala, hypothalamus, thalamus, and is not close to this, and emotions are also generated by some divisions of the prefrontal cortex, such as the anterior cingulate or the orbitofrontal cortex. Moreover, we can find different emotions. We can distinguish from basic emotions to complex or secondary emotions. So, basic emotions we can see as anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness and surprise. And these emotions tend to be generated at the subcortical level. And these emotions are evolutionarily determined, and typically they are experiences and displayed similarity across cultures, because these basic emotions have a great neurobiological emphasis and great genetic determinism. That's why from different cultures, individuals tend to express them psychological, emotionally and behaviorally in the same way. However, we can also differentiate other emotions, which are defined as secondary emotions, or some researchers may refer it as feelings. I have here some examples, such as frustration, distress, bored, calm, satisfied, and so on. There are different secondary emotions which have different intensities and different forms of experiences. Typically, these emotions are generated at the cortical level because they have a great input given by the prefrontal cortex. So, secondary emotions tend to be associated with cognitive interpretations that accompany emotions. Typically, you can call this process as cognitive appraisal. So, typically, secondary emotions are determined in part by their level of arousal, which can range from mild to intense, and their valence, which may be pleasant or unpleasant. As you are seeing, emotional experience is a major aspect of the human life and has different implications on human functioning. So, we can find two major pathways for emotion generation: primary and secondary emotions activation may depend on the pathway by which the stimuli takes to reach the cortex. So we can look by analyzing the fear processing in different brain regions. We can have a stimulus. This stimulus projects itself to the thalamus. The thalamus sends information to amygdala, which also then projects a response. We can call this the fast pathway. So, but when we look to the danger sensation or the sense of afraid in a given context, we are looking to a different set of activation. We can have a stimulus that reaches to the thalamus, and the thalamus projects outputs to the frontal cortex, and then the frontal cortex projects the information to amygdala, and then amygdala produces a response by projecting information to the primary motor cortex. So we are seeing here that in the danger sensation we have a frontal cortex input, and this input gives some context and some previous knowledge about the stimulus. So in this sense we have a mixed response where we have a stimulus and we have cognitive interpretation or a cognitive memory. So we call this a slow pathway. And the secondary emotion is generated because it has more cognitive component than the primary fear. So this is an important distinction between primary emotions and secondary emotions or feelings. They may depend on the different activations which are the product of different pathway activations. So one major aspect that could make some difference between secondary emotions and primary emotions is the cognitive reappraisal, which is a process that is tendency allocated in the prefrontal cortex, because the process of the cognitive appraisal may be seen as the interpretation of the situations and experiences based on the previous knowledge. So, this interpretation is based on previous assumptions and beliefs, and in intentions, goals, or even in psychological needs. So, cognitive appraisal adds a cognitive component to the primary emotion. This is when we start to feel a more complex, a more differentiated emotion, which is called here a secondary emotion or even a feeling. So, there are different models of emotion that could also help us explain how emotion is generated. Cannon-Bar theory states that experience of an emotion is accompanied by physiological arousal. James Lange theory states that the experience of an emotion is the result of the arousal that individuals experience. So, the two-factor theory states that the intensity of the arousal and the cognitive appraisal dictates which emotion individuals will experience. So here we can see that the two-factor theory has an integrative component, where we can explain that the arousal and the association of the cognitive appraisal dictates which emotion will be generated and which emotion individuals will experience. So emotions have different functions. One may be facilitate adaptive responses to environmental challenges. A second may be attach meaning to the events. The third may be communication to self about values, needs, or even if the context is favorable to them. Or even communication to others, because when we manifest an emotion, we are communicating to others an internal state or a disposition, and this behavioral manifestation may be seen as non-verbal behaviors. So, now let's just summarize the contents of today. Emotions and subjective experience are different phenomena, but they are linked together. This phenomenon results from the interaction between the brain, nervous system, and endocrine system. We can differentiate primary and secondary emotions by the level of the arousal and the addition of a cognitive component, and we look to different models of emotions. So, this is just an introductory video related to emotions, but in the future I will produce different videos focused specifically on different aspects or different models of emotions, okay? So, stay tuned! Well, it's all for today. Don't forget to see the video description regarding today's theme in order to see the manuals and the books that I recommend to you. Also, if you like what I'm doing here, please consider to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. And you can use the comment section below to express your thoughts and to express your mind. Let me know what you think about all of this. Welcome to Mind Brain Talks, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye! Hello everyone, welcome to Mind Brain Talks, the place where you find diverse and scientifically accurate information related to psychology, psychotherapy, neuropsychology, neurosciences and research methods every single week. My name is Nº4. I am a licensed clinical psychologist and neuropsychologist who's been working as a therapist, researcher and educator for the past few years. In Mind Brain Talks, I describe and discuss different themes related to psychology and neurosciences and try to describe it the best as I can for you to understand and to learn something about it. So, without further delay, let's jump for today's content. So today I will talk about the concept of emotion regulation. This concept is a very important concept in psychotherapy and psychology because it's the concept that postulates how humans or how individuals are able to regulate or modulate their emotions. Emotion regulation, it's a human ability and it's very important in everyday life. But let's see how it could be defined. Also, this video it will be framed in the category of theories and concepts. So let's see what is emotion regulation. Emotion regulation is the ability to respond to the ongoing demands of experience with a wide range of emotions. It's the ability to respond to the ongoing demands in a way that is socially acceptable or tolerable. This is a very complex process that involves initiating, inhibiting and modulating one's state or behavior in a given situation. For example, subjective experience of anger in a discussion or subjective sadness in a loss. Thus, emotion regulation is a highly significant ability in daily human life. And generally speaking, there is emotion dysregulation that is defined as the difficulties in controlling or the difficulties in emotional regulation. Emotion dysregulation may be seen as the lack of ability to regulate or to modulate emotions. This lack of this ability is highly correlated or highly associated with psychopathological symptoms such as anxiety, depression or interpersonal reactivity. There are lots of psychologists that look to emotional regulation from a different lens. However, Gross is a preeminent author and it's one of the greatest theories based on emotion regulation. He has a theory on the process model. The process model of emotion regulation is based upon a model of emotion. The process model of emotion regulation suggests that emotion generation processes occur in a particular sequence over time. It's a situation that triggers an emotion. Individuals pay attention to the emotion and there is an appraisal based on this attention. Then there is an emotional response that is generated by giving rise to different sensory modalities such as experiential, behavior or physiological systems. Because of an emotional response, it depends on different individuals. This model involves a feedback loop from situation to emotion generation. From this conceptualization, this process model have 5 different modalities in emotion regulation that respond to particular situations. They occur in the following order: 1. Situation selection, 2. Situation modification, 3. Attentional deployment, 4. Cognitive change, and 5. Response modulation. Also, this model divides the emotion regulation strategies into 2 broad categories: antecedent-focused and response-focused. Antecedent-focused strategies such as situation selection, situation modification, attentional deployment, and cognitive change occur before an emotional response is fully generated. response-focused strategies such as response modulation occur after an emotional response is fully generated. So, as you may see, we may have some emotion regulation strategies that we may use before the emotion is triggered, or we may use another kind of emotion regulation strategies that may be activated, or we may use when the emotion is fully generated. Emotion regulation strategies may also be divided into other broad categories. One category is situation selection and situation modification. Another category is attentional deployment. In attentional deployment, we may find strategies such as distraction, rumination, worry, or thought suppression. Another broad emotion regulation strategy is cognitive change. Here, we may find strategies such as reappraisal, distancing, and humor. Another broad category may be response modulation. Here, we may find strategies such as expressive suppression, drug abuse, exercise, or sleep. As you may see, there are lots of strategies that humans use to cope with emotion. However, there are lots of other strategies that were not listed here. In the future, I will look to them and describe the best as I can. Emotion regulation may also be seen as a developmental process. Emotion regulation efforts during infancy are believed to be guided primarily by innate physiological response systems. These systems usually manifest as an approach or avoidance of pleasant or unpleasant stimuli. Between 3 and 6 months, basic motor functioning and attentional mechanisms begin to play a role in emotion regulation, allowing infants to be more effectively approach or avoid emotional relevant stimuli. Infants may also engage in self-distraction and help-seeking behaviors for regulatory purposes. Later, the emotion regulation strategies employed by the caregivers may also be passed or also be learned by infant. The type of attachment style between caregiver and infant can therefore play a meaningful role in the regulatory strategies that infants may learn to use. By the end of the first year, toddlers begin to adopt new strategies to decrease negative stimuli. Strategies may be such as chewing an object or moving away from something that had upset them. At 2 years, toddlers can apply certain emotion regulation tactics to influence various emotional states. Emotion regulation knowledge becomes more substantial during childhood. For example, children aged 6 to 10 begin to understand display rules. They come to appreciate the context within certain emotional expressions that are socially accepted or not. For example, children may understand that upon receiving a gift they should display a smile instead of start to cry. During childhood, there is also a trend towards to use more cognitive emotion regulation strategies such as taking the place of distraction, approach, and avoidance tactics. Also, regarding the development of emotion dysregulation in children, one finding suggests that children who are frequently exposed to negative emotion at home will be more likely to display and have more difficulties regulating high levels of negative emotion. In adolescence, individuals show a marked increase in their abilities to regulate their emotions. Emotion regulation becomes more complex depending on diverse and multiple factors. Additionally, teenagers have an exponential increase of cognitive emotion regulations because of the brain maturation. Finally, in adulthood, as people get older, their motivation to seek emotional meaning in life through social ties tends to increase. Autonomic responses decreases and emotion regulation skills tend to increase. It is important to know that emotion regulation is an ability that is developed through time, and many of the strategies that we use to regulate our emotions are learned in social interactions. In this sense, emotion regulation is a process that combines learned behaviors with brain development. Functional magnetic resonance imaging has allowed for the study of emotion regulation on a biological level. Especially, research over the last decade strongly suggests that there is a neural basis for emotion regulation. Research findings report that there is a correlation between emotion regulation and particular patterns of prefrontal activation. These regions include orbital prefrontal cortex, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex.
Two additional brain structures that have been found to contribute to emotion regulation are the amygdala and the anterior cingulate cortex. An implication of these findings is that individual differences in prefrontal cortex activation may predict the ability to perform different tasks in respect to emotion regulation. Finally, now I will talk a little bit about emotion dysregulation, which is a very pervasive issue in psychopathology. There are lots of people who have psychiatric conditions that also suffer from emotion dysregulation. Individuals who suffer from emotion dysregulation tend to have a rise in psychological and emotional dysfunctions caused by traumatic experiences due to inability to regulate emotions. These traumatic experiences typically may happen in the grade school and are sometimes associated with bullying or victimization. Toxic early experiences tend to be correlated with emotion dysregulation or emotion regulational difficulties. Therefore, individuals who suffer from dysfunctional aspects during childhood and adolescence may be more vulnerable to have psychological symptoms or psychiatric conditions. Emotion regulation is all very important in psychotherapy because lots of schools of psychotherapy have different strategies to deal with emotion dysregulation. Approaches such as cognitive behavior therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, mindfulness-based therapy, or even emotion-focused therapy have different ways to regulate emotions. So now let's just summarize the contents of today. Emotion regulation is an ability to modulate or to regulate emotions. One prominent author, that is Gross, had developed a process model. This model has 5 stages such as situation selection, situation modification, attentional deployment, cognitive change and response modulation. We also saw that there is different categories and different kinds of emotion regulation strategies such as situation selection, attentional deployment, distraction, and is also a developmental process. Emotion regulation has a neurological basis which represents the maturation of the frontal cortex. We saw that emotion regulation is very important in psychotherapy, and emotion dysregulation tend to be associated or correlated with psychiatric or psychological conditions. Well, it's all for today. Don't forget to check the video's description to see the references list regarding today's theme. Before we go, I would like to know what you think about all of this. Use the comment sections below to express your thoughts and to express your mind. Also, if you find these contents useful, leave a like and please consider to subscribe, hitting the bell for notifications. Welcome to Mind Brain Talks, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye!